Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. So I want to thank my guest again for coming for our second segment. This is going to be a very exciting and interesting episode because we're going to talk about the period of time shortly after Benson leaves office and somebody that he encounters, a book that he encounters that really kind of changes the trajectory of where he was going politically. But before we go with that, I just want to tell a little bit about our author, Matthew L. Harris. He's a professor of history at Colorado State University, Pueblo. He is the author of The Founding Fathers and the Debate Over Religion in Revolutionary America. This is one of the books that he edited called Thunder from the Right. We are talking about the book Watchman on the Tower, Ezra Taft Benson, and the Making of the Mormon Right. So let's let me get this view here so we get it. There we go. So there's the book, Ezra Taft Benson, Making the Mormon Right. And eventually I'm going to have a copy in my bookshelf, right?
We can get you a copy.
So either way, so basically what happens is in 1958, there's this book that comes out called The Politician. And it was written by a gentleman by the name of Robert Welch. So tell us a little bit about the man who wrote the book and a little bit about the book.
So Robert Welch is, he's born in 1899 from an old Southern plantation in North Carolina. He's born the same year as Ezra Taft Benson. And he's a brilliant man. He had graduated from college at a very young age. He went to Harvard Law School, and then he clashed with one of the most famous of the Harvard Law faculty, a guy named Felix Frankfurter. And I'm a university professor, and I love students who I don't mind at all when students push back on my ideas or something I say, and as long as it's civil and respectful, and I try to exemplify those same virtues towards my students as I expect them to do towards me and to others. But Welch wasn't one of those guys. When Frankfurter would say something, he would say, "You're wrong." He would just challenge him, it wasn't civil at all. Well, anyway, if you know anything about Frankfurter, the man was larger than life. And just a quick story about Frankfurter. There was a scholar who just passed away a few years ago named Leonard Levy, and he wrote two books that won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. So 2 Pulitzer Prizes, that's how big Levy was. Well, when Levy was going to graduate school, he asked Frankfurter for a recommendation. He had somehow met the crusty Harvard Law professor. And Frankfurter wrote, "To whom it may concern, Levy may make something of himself one day. Sincerely, Frankfurter." And that was it. He may make something of himself one day. And of course, anyone in academia who knows Frankfurter's reputation, this was a glowing endorsement. It took him 2 seconds to have his secretary type. But anyway, that's his personality. And here you have Robert Welch, clashing with him in class. And there was no way on God's green earth Welch was going to win this fight. And so Welch just quit. Frankfurter just forced him out. He quit. And he went to business with his brother, as I recall. And Welch founds this candy company that will produce the caramel lollipop, the sugar daddy, which is one of the most, I remember eating it as a kid. I don't eat much candy now, but as a kid, I would have a sugar daddy. And anyway, that's his signature candy that made him millions. And so when he was in his 50s, as I recall, he decides to retire, a wealthy man. And in 1958, he turns his attention to the booming Cold War. He's disturbed by liberal politics at the time, the New Deal in particular. Franklin Roosevelt is sort of the shadow over every conservative this time, and liberal for that matter. And so he wants to form an organization that will fight against communism. And so he gives a series of talks in 1958 in which he criticizes Eisenhower for failing to roll back the New Deal subsidies, and also failure to essentially shrink the size of the federal government. He's a Republican. This is what a good Republican is supposed to do. Well, obviously Eisenhower doesn't do that. Eisenhower wrote a letter to his brother Milton, and he said that, I'll paraphrase, he said that dear Milton, so many conservatives expect me to roll back the New Deal. But as I've got into office, I realize I cannot do that, for people rely on these these programs. And if these rich oilmen in Texas, that's what he calls them, these rich oilmen in Texas, like H.L. Hunt, think that we can roll back New Deal subsidies, they are wrong and they are stupid. That's what he says. So Eisenhower has this keen sense of what he can do and what he can't do. And so Welch is intensely critical of Eisenhower for failing to roll back the New Deal. He said he would, but he changes his tune. And Barry Goldwater, another famous conservative of the era, he called Eisenhower's administration a dime store New Deal. I mean, it's like New Deal light, but it's still a New Deal. And that's not what conservatives want of their Republican presidents. So Welch is critical of Eisenhower, and he meets with some wealthy businessmen in the late 1950s, in which he lays out a number of his ideas critical of Eisenhower. He's also critical of some decisions he had made during World War II, his failure to open up a second front, and there are some other things. And he says that Eisenhower is a politician, and I'll show your reviewers the title of this book. It's a private manuscript that he writes. Again, private, it's not meant to be public. And he lays out all of his charges against Eisenhower, how he blunders the war, how he fails to roll back the New Deal. But he makes something, a claim or an allegation against Eisenhower, the former president, that will just reverberate throughout conservative circles. He calls this revered five-star president or five-star general turned president, he calls him a commie. And he says his brother, Milton, a close advisor, was also a commie or commie sympathizer. He says that John Foster Dulles, the beloved Secretary of State, who just had passed away in 1959, calls him a commie. And then he calls Allen Dulles, John Foster's brother, who's head of the CIA, calls him a commie. And so these are explosive allegations. And in the spring of 1961, when Benson leaves Washington, when the term is over, the second term, Eisenhower is now an emeritus president and Benson's now an emeritus cabinet secretary. He comes across this explosive manuscript, and his son Reed had discovered it and shared it with his father. And it went something like this: Dad, you got to read this. This is incredible. This will blow your mind. And Benson as a conservative was always uncomfortable with some of Eisenhower's policies. And even in General Conference, he would let out these cryptic references to beware of those in government who create this program and that program. Well, my hell, he's talking about Eisenhower, but he doesn't mention him by name. Beware of those in government. And he's also very critical of Ike. Now, I say very critical in private. He doesn't do this in public. Benson's critical of Eisenhower when Eisenhower creates they didn't call it this at the time, but this is what he creates. We later call it this, but the Department of Education. And I forget what it was called in the 50s, but in the 1970s, Carter changes it to the Department of Education. But Eisenhower creates this new government bureaucracy because the Russians are just moving far ahead of us in this space race, this Cold War, and we've got to be able to have a federal agency to oversee research and development at our nation's universities. Benson sees this not as a Cold War necessity, but as just another vestige of a sprawling bureaucracy. It's the same way he sees civil rights. Why do we need civil rights? If we have civil rights, we'll just have to have another federal bureaucracy to oversee it. He doesn't like any of this stuff. This is his position in the 50s. He's also reading J. Edgar Hoover, who had been the FDI director since 1922. And J. Edgar Hoover has some conspiratorial notions of his own about the influence of communism. He's also, Benson's also influenced by Reuben Clark. We talked about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They exchanged this Protocols pamphlet in 1957 when Benson's still in the government. And he receives the pamphlet from Reuben Clark in Salt Lake City, and he reads it and he says, this is great stuff. And then he sends it back to Reuben Clark. Anyway, Benson was also concerned about Jews in the government. He was influenced by the Protocols. He thought that there were too many Jews in both the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower administrations. And I want to just pause for a moment. I think all of us, myself included, you, Stephen, your listeners, we're all the sum total of our influences, the people who have entered our lives, whether for good or for ill, right? Benson hasn't had much experience with Jews. He grew up in Whitney, Idaho, where there were hardly any Jews, if at all. He didn't have any experience with Black people. There were no Black people in Whitney, Idaho. It's a lily white, bucolic Mormon farming community. There are very few Black people in Salt Lake City when he moves there in the 1940s to assume his duties as an apostle. There are very few Jews in Salt Lake City. So it's a very cloistered worldview, and it will gradually enlarge, of course, as he travels the world in his apostolic ministry, and also as he serves in Eisenhower's cabinet. But prior to that, though, his view was very limited. And so when he goes to Washington and he starts to work with some Black people and mostly Jews, he's not happy about it. They're not principled like him. They come from a different worldview. And so when he left the office, the cabinet in 1961, Robert Welch gives him a way to understand the experience he had just had, provides a lens by which to look at his boss's administration. And Ezra is just riveted by the politician, just absolutely riveted. So much so that he buys several copies and gives them to his fellow apostles. And he says the same thing that his son said to him: you've got to read this. This will change your life. And Ezra made the mistake of giving it to not just the apostles, but the first presidency as well. He made the mistake of giving a copy to a guy named Henry Moyle, this wealthy lawyer who was in the first presidency along with Reuben Clark. And Moyle was a Democrat. There were a few of them at the time, but he was a Democrat. And so when Ezra gave Moyle a copy of The Politician, Moyle calls him in and he sits Taft down. That's the nickname they called Ezra. They didn't call him Ezra, but in private it was always Taft. He said, "Taft, I am so disappointed in you. How could you betray the president like this? This book is a betrayal. How could you?" And I should add that this was a private manuscript and it got leaked out to the press and then they published it. So it became public by the early 60s. But so Moyle just rips him a new one. "How could you do this?" And he said, "Don't worry. I won't strip you of all I won't strip you of your income. Mormon apostles don't get paid a lot of money. They get a living stipend, and they make their money by serving on boards, church-owned companies. So they put the apostles on the boards and they make some extra income that way." So he tells him, I won't take you off the boards. You can still have your income, but I'm very disappointed in you." And so I guess the question, Stephen, if you want me to address this now, is I've been asked this, and I think it's a good question to ask. Benson served with Eisenhower for 8 long, bloody years. How in the hell could he think he's a communist? He wrote John Foster Dulles the most sincere, the most moving letters when Foster Dulles was gravely ill in 1959. I mean, it was genuine, almost to the point of tears, the way that "I'm praying for you, I'll put your name on the prayer roll at my temple," just all of this stuff. And Foster Dulles is part of this too. He's also a commie. How could Ezra believe in any of this stuff? It is just soul crushing. And I've thought about this a lot. And this is a 5-star general you're calling a communist sympathizer. It's crazy. And I thought about this a lot. And the only conclusion I can think of is that Benson was so intensely hurt by Eisenhower not coming to his defense during his cabinet years. Benson's human, and he felt like the president just betrayed him. And so Benson just didn't scrutinize any of this stuff. I have this imaginary dialogue in my head in which Benson would have read this book, The Politician, and he would have written Robert Welch, and he would have said, "You're wrong. I served with him. He's a good man. He doesn't have a communist bone in his body." But Benson doesn't do this. And so he sends out The Politician to his family and friends. He orders it for the church history archives. He gives them away to Christmas gifts to LDS church mission presidents. This is like kid in the candy shop, just giving away copies. And I have all the Birch letters from Benson and from Welch. And I have the receipts of all the, when he would buy the copies, they would send him back. I have all of this stuff. And Benson was so taken in by Robert Welch. He met him for the first time in the spring of 1961, just a few months after he left Washington. And that's when he also became acquainted with the politician about the same time. And Welch asked Benson to speak at the 5-year anniversary of the Birch Society. This would have been in 1963. So it was founded in 58 by a bunch of wealthy businessmen, some of whom were academics. Clarence Mannion was the dean of the University of Notre Dame Law School. So these aren't just like, these fringish weirdos in the corner. These are, on paper, they're respectable people, working professionals, some of whom are in academics, some of whom are politicians. And anyway, so in 1963, Welch invites Ezra Taft Benson. He said, can you come speak at the 5-year anniversary of the Birch Society? And we'd be honored to have you. Now, this is a government person. Nobody in the cabinet has shown any interest in the Birch Society. We'll talk about why in just a moment, I'm sure. So Benson agrees to it. The church president, David O. McKay, gives his assent. Okay, you can go do it. But McKay has no idea what he's going to say. And so Benson goes to LA, where they honor the Birch Society, where they honor Welch. And he says something that he would later regret, which is Benson said that there are people within the government who are communists. That's all he says, essentially. After the talk was over, a New York Times reporter goes up to him and he says, look, I read The Politician. Are you referring to Eisenhower? Do you think he's a communist? Now just pause for a moment. What a hell of a great story, right? You've got a former cabinet member who's being asked if his former boss, a 5-star, is a commie. And Benson, remember I told you, he's not a politician. The guy, he's as honest as the day is long. Benson looks at the reporter and he says, I'm not gonna really answer that. Now, that's crazy. You've just been asked a direct question if your former boss, President Eisenhower, is a communist, and you're not going to answer it. So his refusal to answer is tacit agreement that he believes in Welch's allegations that Ike's a commie. And so the next day in the newspaper, the reporter blows it up on the headlines that former Secretary Benson will not refute Welch's accusation of Ike being a commie. And it's a disaster. There's a Mormon guy. I want to connect this story to Ike if I can for a moment, because Ike hears about this. And there's a Mormon guy, a congressman from Idaho named Ralph Harding. And Ralph Harding was, I think he was 1 or 2-time congressman. He got defeated because of Benson. We'll get to that in a sec. But Congressman Harding's a Democrat. And Ezra Taft Benson was his favorite general authority. When Ralph Harding went on an LDS church mission in 1949, so this is long before he was in the Congress in the early 60s, as a young missionary, Benson had set him apart, gave him a special blessing. That's code word in Mormon land for special blessing. And so Elder Benson, the apostle, set him apart, and Harding said that Benson was his favorite apostle. Well, as a Democrat and as a concerned citizen, Harding thought it was just ridiculous to think that a high-ranking church leader could call the president, the former president, a commie, or at least imply it. And so Harding stays up all night in September of 1963, writing this skewering address that he was going to give on the floor of the US Congress the next day. Just bad-mouthing Benson, his former favorite general authority, pushing back hard that Eisenhower's a commie. And Harding knows that this is perilous to do this for 2 reasons. One, Benson has a massive following in Idaho. He's from Idaho, and Harding's from Idaho. And a lot of people in Idaho are Latter-day Saints. So he knows it could cost him his job if he gives this speech. He also knows that you're not supposed to criticize the Lord's anointed, even if they have a political hat. And so Harding sends his address. He'd stayed up all night writing it. He sends it to his stake president, a guy named Milo D. Smith, who worked for Benson as his secretary, his top assistant in the agricultural department. So just pause for a moment. Here you have Milo D. Smith, who worked with Benson closely in the agricultural department, and he is now a stake president, and he's over Ralph Harding in Washington, D.C. Milo D. Smith says, you should give this talk. It'll be the best thing you can do, and it'll be good for the church. And I wish I could interview Milo D. Smith, because he must have had a transformation, because Milo D. Smith was one of the point persons that Benson had put in charge to get rid of Wolf Laginski.
So I just want to interject something real quick. And so in our first episode, I made a point to tell our viewers that we both of us actually have in our background family and acquaintances that were sympathetic to the John Birch Society or were John Birch Society members. And I just want people to know, because if you're coming across this episode and you hadn't seen our first episode, we're just given the history here. Now, I think it's really important. About a third of the book, or more, almost, yeah, is the endnotes. So if you're a fan of Ezra Taft Benson and you're sympathetic to the John Birch Society, you may not like Matthew's conclusions, but the information's invaluable. If you want to know Ezra Taft Benson better, get this book, and you can check the footnotes and the sources as well. So I just want to get that out of the way. But let's get back to where we were talking about, because this is truly fascinating.
Yeah, that's important to know. My father and his family are from Arizona, and big Birch Society. They're Latter-day Saints in Arizona, and they were my 90-year-old aunt who just passed a few years ago. I didn't realize that she was still having Birch meetings in her home well into the 1990s, even after the Cold War. So that's a little bit of my family's background. My father was never really into it, because we lived in Maine and he was sort of removed from it. But I'm certain that if we stayed in Arizona, where I was born, that he may have been active along with his siblings. But anyway, so Milo D. Smith is the point person to get rid of Wolf Laginski. And we talked in the previous episode, for your listeners who didn't hear that one yet, I talked in the previous episode about how Ezra Taft Benson had fired this Russian-born Jew from his department thinking he was a communist, and it backfired. There was no evidence that he was aligned with communism, and Eisenhower's embarrassed by it. Anyway, but Milo D. Smith was front and center of this entire operation. And now in 1963, he's telling Ralph Harding, you should go ahead and deliver this talk that will just skewer Apostle Benson on the floor of the U.S. Congress. And I wish Milo D. Smith was alive, because I would have loved to have interviewed him. The other person that Harding sends the talk to is Ezra Taft Benson's biggest nemesis in church leadership, a guy named Hubie Brown, who was in the first presidency in the early 1960s. Reuben Clark had died, and Hubie Brown had replaced him. And Brown grew up was born in Salt Lake City, or at least the Salt Lake Territory, as they called it in those days, or Utah Territory, but had spent his formative years in Canada. So he was not a conspiracist. He was a diehard Democrat. He supported Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal, which is really, really rare, because most Mormon leaders are Republicans. And even some of the ones who were Democrats, like Heber J. Grant, the church president, was a Democrat, was not a Roosevelt Democrat. And so anyway, but Brown thought that Benson and the Birch Society were damaging the church. And so Benson was way too political in his sermons. We'll get into that, I'm sure, in just a little bit. So Harding sends the message, or the speech, to Brown, who's the first counselor in the first presidency under David O. McKay. And Brown writes him back and says the same thing that Milo D. Smith says. You could do the church a real favor by giving this address. And so Harding does. He gives the address. And of course, the newspapers cover it, the Washington Post, the New York Times, it's everywhere. And Harding does something that will shine a bright light on Benson. He sends his address to Eisenhower, who's now retired, living comfortably at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And Eisenhower has no idea that his former secretary has turned on him. No idea. But he doesn't say anything. Doesn't say a word to Ezra. They haven't talked since the cabinet years. And about a year later or so, Reed Benson, Ezra's son, joins the John Birch Society and becomes an officer. So this is his employment. And Reed Benson gives this incendiary address in 1965 at Denver, Colorado, not very far from where I live. And a reporter asked Reed after the address, he said, "Do you really think your father believes that Ike's a commie?" And Reed says, "Oh, yes." "Well, why did he keep him in the cabinet then if Ike's a commie and Benson's not?" "Oh, my father used him for protective coloration." Or Ike used my father for protective coloration, sorry. Mm-hmm. Now that was a fancy way of saying that he had to keep this straight arrow in the cabinet to throw off the scent. So that was the protective coloration part. Well, anyway, one of Eisenhower's former secretaries in Washington had now relocated to Denver and saw this in the Denver Post, the article where it talks about protective coloration, all that stuff. And the former secretary mails the article to Ike at Gettysburg. Now, he's already been warned by Harding. And there's another Mormon guy who sent him the same thing, a guy named J.D. Williams, who was a bishop in the church, liberal Democrat, also a bishop. So Ike had received notice of Harding's speech twice over. And now he's getting a third element from his former secretary that Reed Benson's saying that his father really, truly believed that Ike was a communist. Well, anyway, so Eisenhower tracks Ezra down and sends him a letter with the newspaper copy, and he circles the protective coloration. And all he says in the letter is, "I thought you liked me because you admired me. And I thought I liked you, or at least I thought I expressed to you that I admired you. But now you're just saying I kept you around for protective coloration." So he's calling Ezra out. And Ezra was in Europe at the time as a mission. He was a mission president. That was rare, but it happened. They would have apostles serve as mission presidents. And the reason why they sent Ezra in Germany as a mission president in 1965 is to get him the hell out of the country. He was too political. After the Harding disaster, where the newspapers blew it all up, they called him on this mission. Got to get him out of here. Let's hope that he goes over to Germany and he can purge his blood of politics. That's what one senior apostle said. So anyway, he's in Europe when Eisenhower learns about what he's been saying. And so he wrote Ezra a letter, and somehow it made its way to Europe. I guess they forwarded it on from church headquarters. And Ezra wrote him back promptly. He's embarrassed. He's absolutely embarrassed. And he says, "I don't know what Reed said, but I'll get to the bottom of it. I'll find out and I'll get back to you." So I'm in Europe right now. I can't do much about it here. But when I return home to the States, I'll look into it. Now, this wasn't Ezra Taft Benson's finest hour, because a few weeks after he denied knowing anything about Reed Benson's speech in Denver, Ezra Taft Benson also wrote J. Edgar Hoover a letter calling Ike a commie. And he says, "I'll never know why the President Eisenhower had communist sympathies." So this is like 3 weeks after he wrote Eisenhower's letter. So clearly he believes this stuff, but he's got egg on his face. And for the record, he never wrote back Eisenhower. And, there's nothing to say, because that's what his son said, and that's what he said and believed. But their relationship becomes strained because of the Birch Society. And when Eisenhower died in 1969, Benson released a statement calling him a great patriot. And as one of his, I'm not a biographer because my book is not a biography, but as one of the scholars who looked at his life, I conclude that this is his way of showing remorse, that he questioned his patriotism and he felt badly about it in 1969.
Yeah, well, it's it's one of the more remarkable things just to think about how this all happened, and I'm so glad you fleshed it out so well, because I think it gives insight into the man and the motivations. And I think that you're studying Ezra Taft Benson and his mindset is such an important contribution to this literature, because Ezra Taft Benson was an important 20th century political figure, period. It wasn't just because he was the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but he was a significant, very important and consequential person. Now, we got to keep in mind that, so he was a man that both Strom Thurmond and George Wallace were interested in recruiting to have on their ticket, whether he'd be the presidential candidate or the vice presidential candidate. Now, of course, Strom Thurmond was a longtime Democrat, or they were both Democrats, but they were going to run as third-party candidates in both these instances. So during this time, because of Ezra's relationship with the John Birch Society and Robert Welch, he does become a rising star in the right. So he has some political capital that he's been able to build up in his own movement within the conservative wings of the Republican Party, as well as outside of it. So just talk a little bit about some of his political rise actually in the 1960s.
Yeah, so a lot of people ask me, why are you researching Benson? I've done 2 books on Benson. And the first, as you noted, is a collection of essays from BYU scholars and other scholars who have an interest in Mormon studies. And the second one is what we call a monograph, just looking at his views, how he was influenced with his politics, and how his politics in turn influenced the church. So people ask me all the time, why Benson? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, I grew up with him in the church. He was the LDS church president in the 1980s during my formative years. And so he loomed large in our home. He was on our refrigerator, pictures of the Mormon prophet, just as Russell Nelson, the current Mormon prophet, is on refrigerators in today's homes of Latter-day Saints. So my background, my connection there, he signed my missionary papers. So there's that religious and church connection, but he is a significant thinker in the post-World War II conservative movement. I had no idea that he was as influential and as big as he was, speaking out against anti-communism to anyone who would listen. These are civic groups, these are dental organizations he would speak to. He would speak with Reverend Carl McIntyre, Reverend Billy Hargis, all of these anti-communist crusaders who were men of the cloth. Benson was right there with them, albeit from the Mormon tradition. And so he's on the speaker circuit, and sometimes he would get permission from his church authorities, and sometimes he wouldn't. But he was always speaking out against anti-communism to both to Latter-day Saints in the Faith General Conference, which is a biannual event in October and April, and also to civic groups, many of whom were not Latter-day Saints. And because he was known to be such a conservative politician, he became the darling of the far right in the 1960s. And there are several movements to enlist his aid to run for the presidency. Now, this is kind of a challenge, and I want to take your listeners back to something that's important. When Benson had considered joining the cabinet with Thomas Dewey in 1948, Dewey's a moderate Republican. Benson's a conservative. When Benson goes into Eisenhower's cabinet in 1952, Eisenhower's a moderate Republican. Benson's a conservative. It's in Washington where Benson starts to flirt with the extreme fringy parts of the party, right? J. Edgar Hoover would be one of them. J. Reuben Clark would be one of them. A guy named Cleon Skousen, a Mormon writer, would be one of them. And then, of course, when he aligns himself with the John Birch Society in the early 1960s. So Benson is now moving away from conservative mainstream politics, and he is joining the fringe people on sort of the edges, right? These are the people who think that the civil rights movement is led by communists, that Dr. King's works for the Kremlin. I mean, this is really, really as fringy as it gets. And Benson is right there with that. And just to give you an example, Barry Goldwater, who ran, of course, in 1964 against Lyndon Johnson, Goldwater didn't want to turn away any of the Birchers, but he couldn't stand them. He absolutely couldn't stand them. In fact, he told one of his fellow politicians, who had asked him about the politician. He said, "Have you read The Politician?" Goldwater said, "I have a copy and I burned it. And I would suggest that you do the same. Burn every copy you find because it will ruin you politically." They're worried about the kooks and the fringies coming into the party. But yet he doesn't want to turn them away because he needs their vote. And a lot of these folks are coming in and supporting Goldwater. Robert Welch, the Birch president, supports Barry Goldwater. But yet Goldwater doesn't support Welch. William Buckley, this up-and-coming mainstream conservative, extremely conservative writer for the National Review, he can't stand Robert Welch. He calls Welch one of the loonies, right? So the Birch people are getting pushed out into the fringes. Ronald Reagan's another one, very conservative, and he too has some reservations about the Birch people because of what they've said about Eisenhower and because of what they said about the civil rights movement. And they think this is bad for the party. And so, Benson, I want to be clear on something, that in 1964, the same year that the Civil Rights Act is passed, and then the Voting Rights Act is passed the following year in 65, it splits the Republican Party. You get people like Barry Goldwater and his supporters who oppose civil rights because they're afraid that it'll create a federal bureaucracy to enforce it. They oppose it on federal reasons, right? Let the states handle these kinds of things, not the feds. And then you get guys like Nelson Rockefeller, who was the candidate in 1960. You get guys like Dick Nixon. They support civil rights. A guy named George Romney, a Mormon, the father of Mitt Romney. They support civil rights. So you've got prominent Republicans in 64 who support it, and you've got prominent Republicans in 64 who oppose it. And then you get guys on the fringes like Benson, who was with Goldwater. He doesn't support the federal bureaucracy, but he takes it a step further. And he says, not only do I oppose civil rights, but it's communist-led, it's communist-inspired. Goldwater never said that, didn't believe that, although he opposed it, but not for the same reasons as Benson and the Birchers. And that's a huge distinction. And so by 68, not to be too pedantic here with your listeners, but by 68, the Republican Party recognizes that they're not going to win in national political circles unless they support civil rights. And so by 68, when the Republican Party reluctantly agrees, at least some of them reluctantly agrees to support civil rights as part of their party platform, that pushes Benson out. He's now without a home. And the Birchers are now without a home. And so Benson, under the Birchers' influence, they invite him to run on a secret ticket with Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond, as you noted, was a former Democrat. He was also a member of the Dixiecrats in 1948. And in this case, and then he becomes a Republican, and they want Strom Thurmond and Ezra Taft Benson to run in 1968. Benson will be the president and Strom Thurmond will be his vice president. Thurmond was always lukewarm about this. He had just been reelected. He just wasn't interested. I think he thought that there's no way this ticket will go anywhere. And so they formed this secret group in Appleton, Wisconsin, and they call it the Committee of 1776. They're going to restore the revolutionary principles to the nation. But the committee, notice what they did identify themselves as, the Birch Society. By 1968 or 1966 or so, the Birch Society was falling out of favor everywhere in the country. I mean, Barry Goldwater was now denouncing them. Ronald Reagan had said some bad things about them. You know, the Eisenhower stuff, the stuff they'd said about blacks in the civil rights movement. And so, they're quiet about what's going on. But the person who's the chairman of it is a guy named William Greedy, who is a high-ranking member of the Birch Society. And the only reason why they didn't put Robert Welch as the chairman is because that would have been way too obvious that the Birch Society was behind it. So they put this obscure fellow, Bircher, named William Greedy. But Robert Welch would meet with Benson in Salt Lake, and they would work out policy positions as part of their platform. He would fly to Salt Lake. Anyway, the Birchers are behind the Committee of 1776. The Birchers on the committee, they know that it's controversial. They know that Benson, they circulated a secret memo, a private memo among themselves, and they say that we've got a problem with a Benson ticket. We've got Benson, whose church opposes Black people as part of the theology, keeping out blacks from being priests. That'll change in 1978. But at the time, blacks could not hold the priesthood in the Mormon church. And they recognized that that would be a problem, especially since they were being criticized for their position on civil rights. They said that Reed Benson would be a problem because of some of the flamboyant things he'd said about General Eisenhower in public, vis-a-vis his position as a Birch Society employee. And they also said that Strom Thurmond would be a problem. This is the guy that at that point had led the longest filibuster in US history. And of course, filibustering one of the Civil Rights Acts. So it makes you wonder, with all these problems, why the heck did they choose these guys? But the presidential ticket collapses because of Thurman's lack of interest. Benson was far more into it than Thurman ever was. And Benson was the one working with the Birch people, not Thurman. So the ticket collapses, and just about 8 or 9 months after, in 1966, when the ticket collapses, Benson accepts or wants to run as a vice presidential on the ticket with a guy named George Wallace, who left the Democratic Party for similar reasons. He didn't like civil rights, where his party was going. He was a conservative Democrat. So they formed the American Independent Party, and Benson will be the vice president. Benson and his son Reed, they fly to Alabama in February of 1968. So think about the lateness of this hour, right? It's February of 68 and the election's in November. And they have a 3-hour meeting. And both Bensons are just taken in with George Wallace. They think he's a smart guy. He opposes civil rights. He opposes the welfare state. He opposes unions. He opposes federal aid to education. All the things that Benson supports, Wallace does too. And so they finish the meeting. Ezra writes, Robert Welch is by this time a close friend. And he says, Dear Bob, I just met with George Wallace. He's wonderful. He's a good man. Well, the problem is that Benson has to convince David O. McKay, his boss, to allow him to run. McKay was extremely lukewarm about the ticket with Thurman. In fact, he hedged. When McKay was asked, do you want Benson to run with Thurman? He said, well, it's too premature. Let's just see if it gets any traction, then come talk to me, which is kind of strange. Why do all the work if you're going to say no? But that's what he did. He was just sort of stalling. And Benson's colleagues in the 12 didn't want him to run because in the 1950s, the church was under a spotlight and the church didn't look so good. And so they wanted him out of politics. Just focus on your ministry. Well, anyway, Benson felt this higher power to run. And what a better way to warn against communism and big government than to be on a presidential ticket. So Benson's always wanted to be the president, or at least on a ticket. And so knowing that McKay could be a holdup, Benson invites George Wallace to come to Salt Lake to meet with the church president. And Wallace, who's kind of a slippery fellow, but he's a sort of a glib speaker. He talks to the church president. He basically begs him, allow Elder Benson to run. We need him. He's a good man. The country needs him. And McKay says, no way. Just turns him down flat. And one of the biggest reasons why McKay turns him down is not just because of the embarrassment from the 50s, but also the fact that it's a third party. McKay recognizes this is fringy. You can't even get the party nomination with the Republican Party. This is embarrassing. And McKay is a proud, lifelong Republican. And the other reason why he turns him down is McKay says it's a civil rights era, right? Dr. King had recently passed away. The church is coming under heavy assault for its views on blacks. And McKay just says, no way. You'll just bring more attention to our Negro policies, he calls it. I'm not going to support this. I should tell your readers, George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, was one of the biggest, most prominent segregationists of his era, along with Strom Thurmond. If you were to ask anybody in the 60s, name me 2 politicians who oppose civil rights and support segregation, they'd most likely tell you George Wallace and Strom Thurmond. And so that tells you a lot about who Benson wants to run with. But I'll just say this, one last thought on this topic, that the people that were supporting Wallace's presidency were the Ku Klux Klan the Nazis and the Birchers. And so President McKay was wise to keep Elder Benson off this ticket, because this is not what the church needs. They don't want to be associated with their apostles serving on a party that's supported by the Klan, the Nazis, and the white citizens councils. It would have come back to bite the church in the fanny.
So, it's interesting. A lot of people don't realize in 1968, George Wallace did end up running for president. He carried many of the same states that Barry Goldwater carried in 64. There's an overlap there. And so just give a little education. I think he was about 14-15% of the popular vote, and then won some electoral votes in the election. So he was not an insignificant figure, and that was not an insignificant presidential run. So we're running short on time here. I just have to, first of all, Robert Welch, but this is our John Birch Society segment, so I feel like I got to kind of cram a few things in here. Robert Welch made a quote in your book, said, "Mormons make good Birchers." Also, during this time in the 60s, Benson, and we'll actually talk about the General Conference stuff later, but he was giving speeches at General Conference because not only was he talking to dental conventions, but he was also talking about secret combinations and the white horse prophecy during these things. And so do you think that those things kind of laid the groundwork, those beliefs like the secret combinations and the white horse prophecy, were those things that would have influenced Mormons to kind of become good Birchers, as Robert Welch said?
Well, I think yes, but there's probably a little bit more to it. Mormons are conservative by and large. The church was founded in the Intermountain West. These are farming communities back in the 19th century. This isn't to say that everybody's always been conservative in the church. The church had some very prominent liberal suffragists, for example, in the early 20th century. And there were some liberals in leadership. But by and large, in the 20th century, the church will start to slowly morph towards the Republican Party. And they supported, I want to be clear on something. The church in Utah, anyway, supports Franklin Roosevelt. They support the New Deal. They need government assistance like any other person in the United States. And they support Eisenhower, but they also support Lyndon Johnson. So they're going back and forth for a little bit in the 50s and 60s. But by the early 1970s, they support Utah Mormons support Nixon, and they never turned back from the Republican Party. And that's been that way ever since. And in part because Benson always said that you can't be a good Mormon and a good Democrat. But it's also part because Mormons agree with the Republican Party's stance against civil rights, because the Mormon Church opposed civil rights for so many years, and also against big government and high taxes and ERA and abortion. So a lot of the things that really helped to set a foundation for evangelicals in the 1970s that made it possible for them to thrust Ronald Reagan into office in 1980, Mormons are right there lock, stock, and barrel with them. I mean, you wouldn't even know if you took out the word Mormon or evangelical on some kind of, sermon or talk that an evangelical minister would give. It'd be the same talk a Mormon would give about high taxes and big government and abortion and civil rights. They're linking arms in many respects. Anyway, so Robert Welch is, by this point in the 60s, this is really, I think, important to point this out. He's not only becoming more controversial nationally in the 1960s. I mean, it sort of blows it open with William Buckley writing these horrible things about the Birchers. And they're coming under assault. There's no doubt about it. And Robert Welch recognizes that Elder Benson can help to rehabilitate the Birchers' tarnished image. And Benson, of course, recognizes the Birch Society can help him fill his apostolic mission to warn against big government. So Welch and Benson form this common worldview. And they're also friends. They really genuinely like each other. And some of their letters are really endearing. I mean, Benson would write him a letter, "Dear Bob, what are you doing today?" And Bob would write back, "Dear Ezra, I'm sure you wouldn't approve this, but I'm working on the Sabbath." And Robert Welch was a Catholic, and he admittedly wasn't a very good Catholic. But anyway, so they have this common worldview about big government, and they both need each other. And Welch recognizes that he himself as a political candidate would never work. He's too controversial. But Benson could work because of his stature with the Eisenhower administration. But I'll say this about the Birch Society, since we're talking about this segment, is that it wasn't just Eisenhower that got the Birchers in trouble. They had a number of people like Nazis and White Citizens Council members and segregationists. They were forming the ranks of the Birch Society. And so mainstream Republicans and of course liberals and Democrats and just everybody in between, they started to call the Birchers racists. In some of their journals that I've seen, the New American Magazine or the American Opinion, there was one article I read that called blacks pigs and dogs. And so when some people say, oh, they're not racist, I mean, oh my goodness, are you kidding me? Pigs and dogs. And then they're constantly supporting politicians like Strom Thurmond and George Wallace, and they're promoting segregation. They're calling Dr. King a communist. I don't know how anyone with a straight face could say that's not racist, right? They also, I want to say something true. I know I'm being a little forthright here, but one of the things the Birchers did was they had, in 1958, when Martin Luther King had gone to a special school to train how to be a civil rights protester. It's called the Highlander School in Monteagle, Tennessee. And this young, recently graduated PhD in theology from Boston University, Martin Luther King, this younger man, he hasn't really hit his stride yet as a famous preacher, but he goes there. And there's a photographer who's a Klansman who shows up. And he takes a picture of the group, and Martin King is sitting next to a former member of the Communist Party. King's never met this guy before. He has no idea who he is. And remember what I said a minute ago about why I'm not defending communism. I think it's ridiculous, to be honest, my personal beliefs. But that's why a lot of people in the 30s were embracing communism, is because of capitalism's failures or perceived failures. And so this guy sitting next to Benson was a member of the Communist Party back in the 30s, but he was no longer a communist in 1958. We have him on record. And anyway, so this Klansman takes this picture, and the Birch people just run with this picture to the nth degree. They put a picture of, I wish I had a show your viewers, but it's a picture of King in this picture of this school. They're learning how to be activists to protest segregation and to advance civil rights. And the Birchers will take this picture and blow it up and put it on billboards across the United States. They'll put it in their magazines. They'll send it to politicians. And this is all proof, of course, that communists have infiltrated the civil rights movement. And while we're at it, I can say two more things. That critics of who say the King is a communist, they'll talk about two people in his inner circle. And they're right about this. These are two people who are indeed in his inner circle. One's Bayard Rustin, a black gay man. And the other one is a guy named Stanley Levinson. And I say black gay man because he's got 2 strikes against him, right? He's gay in the 50s and he's black. Oh, 3 strikes. And he was a former member of the Communist Party. Then you've got Stanford Levinson, who was also a former member of the Communist Party. That's true. They were former members of the Communist Party. The operative word is former. And King, Dr. King had been warned by people. Look, the Birchers, Hoover, they're saying that you're a communist because you've got Levinson and Bayard Rustin you're hanging out with. You got to drop these guys. So some of Dr. King's closest advisors say, get rid of these guys. And King's response is, why would I do that? They're good at what they do. We need them. They no longer affiliate with the party. They told me they don't. And Hoover has them on record, by the way, from FBI wiretaps, that he knows they're not commies, but he feels threatened by Dr. King. And Ezra Taft Benson is caught up in this too. He too circulates this Highlander folk school picture of Dr. King sitting next to the commie, the alleged commie. And he sends it to the BYU president, Ernest Wilkinson, one of his closest friends. He sends it to people in the church leadership. And this is all proof that the civil rights movement has been fomented by commies because Dr. King is now sitting next to a guy who happened to be a former member of the party. They're just smearing and tarnishing his reputation.
So we're running a little late, but I have to put a bow on this I think it's important to include it in this particular episode. So, and this is actually something I don't think you've ever revealed to anybody before, but basically, in order to do a lot of your research, you needed to get some archival material to study with. In other words, old John Birch magazines and publications and everything like that. So it's not like you could just go to your local library and get these things. So you actually were in contact with the library at UCLA, and they have a fairly large collection there. And you asked for some old American Opinion, Birch Logs, and maybe some New Americans. And so they sent you those publications, and so they arrive and you look at them, and what do you see?
I look at them. So I, like you said, I tried to find, let me back up just for a quick second. I got all of the letters from the former Birch president, a guy named John McManus, very nice man. Told him about my family being Birchers, told him about my book with Ezra Taft Benson. He knew Benson, knew him well. They were friends, and he was thrilled to give me all of this stuff. So I got the letters, and he sent me the politician. So he's very generous. But I also wanted the published Birch writings that Benson always talked about and read. He was a frequent subscriber. And so I went to my library at Colorado State University, Pueblo, where I work, and talked to the interloan librarian. And I said, I need these Birch magazines, the American Opinion, the New American, as you mentioned, and the Birch Logs. Can you get them for me? He said, sure. So he went into his system, he pulled it up, and he said, looks like UCLA is a lending library. They have it. We'll order it from them. I said, fine. About a week or two later, big old bundle like this comes in, and he gave it to me. I was in his office, and I started to look at it like this, and there are red underlinings everywhere, and there are little writings in the margins that says, good point, brilliant, agreed. And I thought, damn, that looks familiar. It looks like Ezra Taft Benson's writing, but I couldn't prove it. And I looked further, and then I started at the top right-hand part of the quarter, it said ETB, ETB. He started to put his initials on various pages. I don't know why, but he did. So I had his personal copies of the Birch literature, and I asked his grandson, I said, how did it end up in UCLA? And his grandson was intrigued, and he said, I don't know. Probably my father liked to give things away. He probably gave it to a Bircher Latter-day Saint from California, and who probably just donated it to UCLA. But so I got Benson's personal copies of Birch literature, and it was really important to me as a scholar because I could see how certain passages influenced it.
I grew up a Calvinist, perhaps you were preordained, or something to have this happen.
Foreordained.
Yeah, you would say foreordained. We'd say preordained. It's pretty wild. It's just insane. It blows my mind when you told me about that the other day. And it's really cool that this is the first place that the public knows that you actually were handling the very New Americans and American Opinions that he was. And that's just so fortuitous, so cool. And I think that really kind of puts a bow on all this. So just our listeners, I know this is some great information. Even if you're sympathetic you're a member of the John Birch Society, this is history. He's got everything documented, and you can check the footnotes yourself. And I think it's really important that, if you're studying any subject, and I'm doing this with restoration, I say you look at all perspectives. That's so important. So even the people that you admire, it's good to read the criticism as well, because guess what? We're all human beings. We all have feet of clay, and you need to know the whole person, and then you really can get a better understanding of what motivated them and everything. So Matt, I want to thank you. We're finishing off this segment. I'm really looking forward to our final segment. I just want to remind our viewers to like and subscribe, hit the like button and leave your comments underneath, and also ring the bell for a notification for our next episode. So Matt, thank you very much. And we will be talking to you again.